So my name is Gil Matthews, and we're here talking with, and today we're talking with Mr. Terry Brown. Terry, welcome to Talking With.
Thank you, Gil. Great to be here.
Great to have you, sir. So kind of titling of this is, and on another note, because this is somewhat about the history of music in the mountains. And what I found interesting, Music in the Mountains, 40 years old.
Yes, it is.
Going on more than 41 now, right?
I believe it depends on when you start the clock. The very first concerts were in June of 1982, so that would be 41 this year. But of course, we had a few days before, or a little bit before that, in getting it all set up.
Yeah, and speaking of set up, it was interesting for me to note that Music in the Mountains was built on some rather unsavory conduct. I was reading your bio there, and if I may read this, sir, this is in the bio for Mr. Terry Brown. It says, learning via the school of hard knocks and literally begging, borrowing, and stealing from others. So that's the history of Music in the Mountains by theft.
Well, you know, Gil, I actually thought you were going to refer to how the whole idea came about. And some 42 years ago, a number of us were singing in what was then called the Golden Chain Chorale here in town. And after concerts, or after rehearsals, we used to get together at a member's house and drink copious amounts of wine and talk about all sorts of things. And then this idea came up of, let's do a summer music festival.
Really? What was better done, wine drinking or singing? Which one would you like?
Well, in those days, I actually drank wine. These days, I'm a beer man. But I will say the quality of the wine we were drinking then was box, large bottle, if you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
Uh-huh.
But out of that came some pretty marvelous music. So those conversations around the wine bottle, starting Music in the Mountains, what was that conversation like?
Well, as I say, we were talking about things and the idea came up of, we think we have an area that's attractive to tourists and such. And we also don't currently have orchestra concerts and things like that. And so maybe a music festival, a summer festival would be the answer. So the whole process was, of course, there were those of us that were number crunchers. And so we said, let's put together a budget. Let's see what we could come up with. And so we came up with a budget that was a whopping $40,000 at that time. And then we realized, well, we need a board of directors. So we called together, I'm not sure how many people, about 25 people, leaders in the community and such, and laid out our plans, this wonderful dream we had, and said, we need board of directors. Who would like to be on our board of directors? And all but 14 of them said, no, thank you, got up and walked out of the room. So there were 14 of us left at that point. Or actually, there were 15 of us left at that point, 14 people plus myself. And then we looked around and said, well, we're going to need somebody to run this whole thing. And who should we get to do that, like an administrator? And I said, well, I'm currently unemployed. Why don't I run it? And that, by the way, is how I became executive director, which is a post I held for 18 years after that. And parenthetically, I did get paid that first year. When it was all over, they gave me a briefcase.
Really terrific.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a competitive process to make you the executive director.
Oh, it was very competitive. I beat out everybody else who wanted it.
That's probably true. But you and I both love statistics, don't we?
Yeah.
And so everybody that wanted it was a number equal to or approaching zero.
No, it was one. And, I was the only one that wanted it. So, I jumped into it. It's kind of interesting, Gil. Before that, my, quote, career was training as a music educator certified to teach music education K through 12 in Florida. And then I had worked in San Francisco in the customer relations department of California Canners and Growers. And this really prepared me, I think, to be an administrator in a music organization. But I liked numbers, I liked arts and music, and it seemed to go together.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's also in your bio that it was called customer service and something in San Francisco. Interesting. Well, I was not invited to that meeting in 1982, although I was living in the community at the time. I don't take any offense at that. Don't worry about that, Terry.
I think you might have been busy with Benchmark Thermal. I'm not sure.
I probably was very busy. Remembering that first year that I had the company on 4th of July and everyone was out having a good time and I was at the factory working.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a different talking with. Today we're talking with Terry Brown about the early days of music in the mountains, or On Another Note. Tell me about some of that first concert and some of the early concerts, and what was the hill you had to climb?
Well, the first thing was deciding where we were going to perform. And at that point, we decided to go with 3 different locations. It was quite an ambitious first festival, I will say. We did performances in the Nevada Theater in Nevada City, in I believe at that point it was called the American Victorian Museum, now known as the Miners Foundry. And then we also performed in St. Joseph's Hall in Grass Valley, which is a charming pressed tin walls, beautiful acoustics. You shower singers would like it because it's like singing in a big shower. And so we had to move equipment from one place to another, back and forth. And we were a typical, what's known as a working board at that point. So we had board members who did the fundraising. We had board members who did the marketing. We had board members who carried the music stands, as well as their children who helped with that. And I should say, by the way, one of the children who I think he was in his early teens then, who helped to move the music stands and such, today is our stage manager for most of our productions. And I'm not going to give away his age, but we know it's at least 40 years from when he was then. And that's Greg Vanderveen, son of 2 of our first board members.
I remember going to their home once for a fundraiser for Music in the Mountains.
I imagine it was a gourmet dinner of some sort.
It was a wine and
Okay.
hors d'oeuvre event. I remember one of the first outdoor concerts that I went to of Music in the Mountains. I found very interesting. It was at the fairgrounds. It was due to start at 3 o'clock on a June afternoon, and it came 3 and 3:30, and there were no musicians. And the word finally came out that the violin players weren't going to take their instruments out in the sun. Is that a true thing?
Well, as you know, stories morph, and I will give you my feeble memory of what happened at that concert. It actually, I think they actually did come out on stage, but the varnish on the instruments was actually starting to melt. It was so hot. And of course, we're talking instruments that are $40, $60, $100,000 instruments. And so they refused to play. Eventually, the sun went down enough that they came out. Now, what you might not remember is, I'm pretty sure there was a piano concerto on that concert, and it was Lynn Shugren, who's still playing around here these days. And at that point, our, quote, stage, I'm giving you the air quotes here, Gil, was a platform out in the middle of a field. No covering, nothing like that. And I remember when it came time for Lynn to start playing, she hit the very first chord, and you could hear the piano going out of tune because it was so hot. So forgive me, but she would go like, D. You could hear it going down. It was really pretty funny. But along those lines, a few years later, we had progressed, and we were using as our outdoor stage the stage big concrete platform. It's right next to the narrow gauge railroad building at the fairgrounds, if you know where that is. And we were on that, and our covering at that point was a balloon arch in front of it. We still had no covering. And I remember that we were playing along, having a great time out there, and all of a sudden the clouds came in and it started to sprinkle. And it was the most amazing sight because it was almost like it was rehearsed. The orchestra, as one, all rose up and ran for the covering after that. Now I ran the other direction towards the box office. And our box office person was still sitting there. And when I got there, she said, well, what do I do? Do I start refunding tickets? I said, no, you take the cash box and you get the heck out of here because we are not refunding tickets unless they call us afterwards. Well, sure enough, the rain cleared. It was just a little sprinkle. And about a half hour, it wasn't even a half hour later, we finished the concert and went back. We did have some people who called us afterwards and said, we want a refund because it rained and we had to leave. And we had to say, well, A, we'll ask you not to ask for that. And B, sorry you left. We finished the concert.
The concert was performed.
That's right. That's right.
Fun story, fun story. And I imagine there's a zillion of those fun stories in the history of music in the mountains. We're here talking with Terry Brown on the early days of music in the mountains, or On Another Note, as we have subtitled this. But then you advanced along, and then you had that great big canopy that you would bring in and set up. And I always thought music in the mountains was not particularly bright, that they did that big Americana concert on the 3rd of July, knowing they would have to tear it down prior to early morning on the 4th of July.
Well, it kind of comes into the, if you want to do a Happy Birthday America concert in our community, you don't do it on the 4th. Because we've got the city of Nevada City, city of Grass Valley, we've got Penn Valley. Everybody is doing stuff that day already. And so we thought, yeah, we'll do it on the 3rd. You know, as far as whether it was smart or not, I'm not sure that drives all of our decisions, does it, Gil?
Well, certainly not yours and mine.
But you're correct. I think what you're referring to is that in those days, and it was a big tent that covered all of the orchestra and chorus, is we did need to get it down before July 4th festivities started at the fairgrounds the next morning for 2 reasons. One was vandalism. You know, if the people coming in there, it would be very easy for the tent to be vandalized. Not that we expected our wonderful crowd to do that, but it was possible. And the other was fireworks. If there were any embers that came down or anything like that, it could put a hole in it. So for a number of years while we did that, I remember that it was definitely at sunrise, around 6 a.m., after working all night long, that we managed to get that down and trucked out of there. Later, we moved the location and did some negotiations with the fairgrounds and such, and were able to leave it up a little bit longer.
Smart on your side. So there must be a lot of stories. I was interested looking at your website the other day. Your new president, Judith, came here in 1982, the same year that I kind of came up here. And I met her in 1982, and it was fun to see her as your current president of Music in the Mountains. Your budget has grown a little since those early days. As has your board. Well, actually, the number, I guess, has gone down because you were at 14, and now I think you're at 10 or something like that.
Actually, it's more about the same, Gil. It's about 15 now, I think.
Is it? Well,
yeah.
That website was, I breezed through it.
Well, you know, and don't hold me to those kinds of numbers. Hopefully, I'm very glad you didn't ask me for exactly what our budget is right now.
No, I wouldn't put you on the spot for that, but the one thing that has always amazed me, one of the things that's amazed me about Music in the Mountains is their music. It's phenomenally good music on anyone's scale. Those early years, how did you entice that class of performers to come to this podunk town?
Well, our artistic director at that time, our original one, Paul Perry, who was here for 28 years, I believe. But he had come from the Bay Area, San Francisco, and he knew some players down there already. One in particular, Tom Rose, who was a clarinetist, and he was the jobber, I think they call it, for the San Francisco Ballet Orchestra. He played in the orchestra, and he's the one that hired all of the orchestra players for that band, as we love to call it in the business. And so Paul called Tom, and he said, well, we're going to do this thing, Tom. I need, X number of players, and, put them together, which Tom did, got a great crew to come up here. It's interesting. Tom has played with us almost every single festival in those 40 years, and we have 4 others, I believe, that have been with us that long, all the 40 years. So, but the interesting thing, it's one thing to say, hey, we got this gig going on, why don't you come up and, have fun playing with it? It's another to get them to come back. And I think the secret to that has been hospitality, no less than that. Not only do our audiences love what they do, but we treat them pretty well. They stay in the homes of local residents, and so there's been a lot of great friendships. I think there's been some marriages that have come from that also. Oh, yeah. And then like at rehearsals, we do what's called goodie patrol. So when we have a break between the 2 parts of the rehearsal, there's a nice spread of food that's out there for the orchestra, and of course when the chorus is performing also, to be part of that. I would be remiss if I didn't also say, Gil, that I think our community is extremely fortunate in the level of arts that we have here. I think Music in the Mountains obviously does a really fine job. I think our friends at In Concert Sierra with their productions are really fine. It is world class here in our little community. And I'm not even going to go into all the great theater and visual art and all that kind of stuff. But so far, there's been kind of a magic up here that has helped the arts to flourish.
Very much so. And one of the things that's wonderful is that Grass Valley, Nevada City are a cultural district, of which there are very few, and we're fortunate enough to have that. So the arts are vibrant here and have been vibrant all along since the gold rush.
Yep.
Nevada City being sort of the cultural district, Grass Valley sort of the blue-collar worker area, but some of that's sort of shifting also now.
Oh, yeah, with the Center for the Arts in Grass Valley. I mean, it's kind of a hard argument to make with the great job that they do. One of the things when we talk about tracing history and such is that sometimes we like to claim that we're actually descended from the Cornish miners that used to sing in the mines, and that became the Golden Chain Chorale, which then became the Music in the Mountains Chorale. I didn't go into that, but it actually, their conductor retired, and then Paul became the conductor, and then that became the Music in the Mountains chorus, and off we went to the races there.
It's been a wild ride for 40 years, I suspect, and I think looking forward 40 years more to come. Every year you seem to do more things, better things, which is, I find, almost impossible because the quality that you bring is rather phenomenal. So we're here today with Terry Brown, a past executive director for Music in the Mountains, now just a mere board member for Music in the Mountains, talking with, and on another note, give us one last good story about the early days of Music in the Mountains. Maybe what happens behind the curtain that we don't know.
Well, I referenced kind of a little bit that about staying in homes, establishing relationships and things like that. I know that we had an orchestra member who got to know one of our production people, and they got married. We've had some couples in the orchestra also that were already married. Okay, well, I think Ramona from the media center here asked me to tell a really juicy story, and I'm not going to do that but there might actually be some juicy stories out there. I'm pretty sure. Oh, I know. Here's a good one. So I think it was like about the third year of the festival, and Paul and I were in, what was the name of that restaurant? It was behind what is now the coffee shop in Nevada City. It used to be the Fur Traders. It used to be a little old diner restaurant in there. Anyway, we were in there having dinner, and these two women came over to us and said, "Hey, is the summer festival going to be again this summer?" And we said, "Oh, yeah, it'll be like in 3 weeks." And one of them turns down to the other and in this gleeful voice shouts, "Oh, goody, the French horn players are coming back to town."
Whoa. Yeah.
And I'd love to hear the story behind that one.
Yes. Wonderful stories of the early days of music in the mountains. So we're here with Terry Brown talking with. Terry, thanks for coming by today and spending some time with us on this podcast. And we look forward to 40 more years of great music and wonderful partnerships in the community.
Thanks, Gil. As always, a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you, Terry. That's it for us today. We'll be back next month with Talking With again.